The pass has a sound at night. Not the sea, though it's close enough that you can taste salt on your lips. Not the wind, though it slips down the mountain like something sharpened and patient. It's the springs. They hiss and breathe. Warm sulfur rises out of the earth in slow exhalations, curling over stone and vanishing into the dark. The locals call this place Thermopylae, the hot gates, as if the world itself carved a doorway here long ago, then forgot to lock it. Tonight, that doorway is all that stands between an empire and the heart of Greece. You're standing where the land narrows into a corridor, cliff wall on one side, the sea on the other. In daylight, it's almost ordinary, rock, scrub, shallow surf, but at night, with distant campfires flickering beyond the bend, Thermopylae becomes something else. A throat, and you can feel the world holding its breath. Near the broken wall, a Spartan camp lies quiet. Not the quiet of comfort, more like the quiet of a bowstring pulled tight and held. Men sleep in the disciplined way they've learned to sleep, armor close, shields stacked, spears within reach. No loose talk, no wasted movement. And still, one man doesn't rest. King Leonidas sits with his cloak pulled tight against the night air. He looks less like a performer in a legend and more like what he actually is, a commander carrying a problem too large for any one person to solve. His face is calm, but it's the kind of calm you get after long practice, after years of being trained to keep your fear from steering your hands. He turns a small object between his fingers, a seal stone worn smooth by time, a personal thing, private, something that reminds him he's not only a king, he's a man, tethered to a home and a city that expects everything from him. His eyes don't linger on the stone, they drift north, into the darkness beyond the pass. He's thinking about Delphi, about the oracle's words spoken in that smoke-filled sanctuary where every sentence seems to arrive half from this world and half from somewhere older. Either Sparta will fall or a Spartan king must die. Prophecy is a strange weapon. It never grabs your hand and forces you. It simply leans close and whispers, "This is the price," then waits to see whether you flinch. Leonidas doesn't flinch, but that doesn't mean it's easy. Across the water, in another camp that feels like it belongs to a different universe, another man refuses sleep. Xerxes, the great king of Persia. He sits beneath a pavilion that looks like a traveling palace. Lantern-light pools on carved wood and rich cloth, perfumed smoke rises from braziers. Attendants stand with the stillness of people trained to be invisible. Beyond them, the sea shifts under the weight of ships. Xerxes did not cross continents to negotiate. He came with the idea of inevitability, the belief that resistance is childish and submission is wisdom. Empires thrive on that belief. They don't just conquer land, they conquer expectation. They make people assume the outcome before the fight begins. A servant offers Xerxes watered wine. He doesn't take it. He's listening. Not to the springs, not to the wind, not even to the murmurs of his own camp. He's listening for the sound he expects to hear from the Greeks, a crack in their nerve, a stumble, a retreat. But the pass remains silent. That silence irritates him more than any insult, because silence is not fear. Silence is choice, and choice is the one thing an empire cannot tolerate from those it intends to rule. Far to the south, another man watches another doorway, this one made of water. Themistocles stands on a shoreline near Athens, where sleek war galleys rock gently like predators kept on leashes. The moon lays a pale road across the sea, and for a moment the water looks almost peaceful. But Themistocles doesn't see peace when he looks at the sea. He sees a battlefield that can be shaped. Years earlier, Athens found new wealth in silver. Many wanted to spend it on comfort, on display, on celebrations that would make the city feel invincible. Themistocles pushed for something less beautiful and far more useful. Ships. Not just a few, a fleet. A force that could fight where Persia was strongest and still make Persian strength feel clumsy. People argued with him. They called him paranoid. They called him power-hungry. They said he was dragging Athens towards danger. Now Persia is here, and the sea itself seems to prove him right. Themistocles watches sailors move along the docks, checking ropes, balancing loads, tightening fittings. He doesn't bark orders like a man trying to sound heroic. He simply watches, measuring readiness the way an architect measures a structure, quietly and with an understanding that one weak joint can break everything. And then there's the fourth figure, easy to miss, because history rarely looks toward the shadows until the shadows have already changed the outcome. Ephialtes. He is not in a palace.
He is not surrounded by loyal guards. He is not wrapped in banners or authority. He moves in the hills, in the rough places where people live close to the land and far from glory. He knows the paths around Thermopylae. He knows where the cliffs open, where the pines conceal a track, where a man can walk unseen if he's careful. And he knows something else too, something the poets don't like to say out loud. He knows what poverty feels like. He knows what it's like to watch great men speak about freedom while small men count their coins and wonder how to feed their families. He knows how quickly an empire can turn a moral choice into a paid transaction. Thermopylae is not only a contest of shields and spears, it's a contest of psychology. Who blinks first? It's a contest of alliances. Who stays united when fear tries to pry them apart? It's a contest of logistics. Who can endure, supply, and move under pressure? And most dangerously, it's a contest of information. Who knows the ground? Who knows the routes? Who knows where the doorway truly is? In modern terms, it's a battle fought as much in the mind as in the body. And that might be why it still feels so close to us, even after centuries. Because we understand this kind of conflict. We see it in every crisis where a smaller force tries to hold a narrow advantage against a bigger power. Back at the hot gates, the springs continue to breathe. Steam rises and slips across the road like a living thing. Torches flicker, armor creaks softly as men shift in sleep. Leonidas sits in the dim light and listens to the night, not because he's afraid of the dark, but because he's measuring time, measuring silence, measuring what the enemy does when the enemy believes it cannot lose. Xerxes sits beneath his pavilion and listens too, for the opposite reason. He is trying to hear the moment the Greeks finally accept what he thinks is obvious, that their resistance is pointless. Themistocles watches the sea and listens for the wind, because wind decides the rhythm of fleets and the timing of traps. Ephialtes listens for opportunity, for the moment when someone, somewhere, will pay for a secret that only he can sell. Tonight, the world is quiet. But it's the kind of quiet that comes before something enormous. Because tomorrow, the hot gates will stop being a place on a map. Tomorrow, it will become a question asked in steel and answered in courage. And once that question is asked, nobody, king or commoner, gets to pretend they didn't hear it.
To understand why Thermopylae happened the way it did, we need to rewind about 10 years, back to a flat stretch of coastline that still echoed with shock and humiliation. In 490 BC, on the plains of Marathon, Persia launched its first major invasion of Greece. King Darius the Great expected a quick lesson, a swift punishment. Athens had supported a Greek uprising against Persian rule, and the empire had come to remind everyone what defiance cost. But Marathon didn't end like imperial script. A smaller, highly motivated Greek force, led largely by Athens, met the Persians head-on and drove them back. It wasn't just a military setback, it was a public insult. The kind of insult empires don't forget, because empires survive on reputation as much as on armies. Darius swore he would return and erase the shame. He began preparing for a second invasion, and then he died before he could. In an empire, momentum doesn't disappear when a ruler dies. It transfers. It becomes inheritance. So the obsession passed to Darius' son and successor, Xerxes I. Xerxes wasn't simply finishing his father's work. In his own mind, he was correcting history. He saw himself as chosen, destined to succeed where his father had been denied. And he wasn't coming to negotiate tribute or teach a limited lesson. He intended to break Greek resistance permanently and absorb Greece into the Persian world. That required scale, and Xerxes prepared scale like the ancient world had rarely seen. Our main storyteller for these events is Herodotus, brilliant, biased, and sometimes far too eager to impress. He describes Xerxes' host as if it were endless, as if millions marched behind the king. Modern historians don't accept numbers like that. The land simply couldn't feed it, the roads couldn't move it, the water sources couldn't sustain it. But here's the point that matters. Even when you bring those numbers down to something more realistic, maybe tens of thousands, maybe well over 100,000, supported by a massive fleet, the result is still the same from the Greek perspective. It feels like a tide with armor and banners, a tide that doesn't negotiate with small city-states. To make that tide possible, Xerxes didn't rely on soldiers alone. He relied on engineering, because engineering is how an empire turns ambition into movement. He ordered a canal dug through the Athos Peninsula so the fleet could avoid dangerous coastal waters that had destroyed Persian ships before. He also commanded something even more audacious, a bridge across the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia and Europe. Not a stone bridge, a living bridge. Ships lashed together, planks and earth laid across them, until the army could literally walk from one continent to another. Herodotus gives us a dramatic moment here. He claims a storm wrecked the first bridge, and Xerxes, enraged, punished the sea and executed the engineers. That detail may be embellished, but it captures something the Greeks believed deeply about Xerxes, that he didn't see limits as real. He saw nature itself as something that should obey. From a modern angle, it's less mystical than it sounds. Xerxes was building speed. Speed reduces risk. The longer a massive army waits, the more it eats, the more it grinds supply lines, the more it invites unrest behind it. Crossing quickly wasn't just spectacle, it was strategy. And as Xerxes' preparations became known, panic spread across Greece. Because Greece wasn't a single country, it was a fractured world of rival city-states, alliances that could shift in a season, grudges that lasted generations. Athens and Sparta were not friendly partners. They were competitors with completely different identities, and they didn't naturally trust one another. So when the Persian threat rose like a storm on the horizon, some Greek states did what frightened people often do when faced with an overwhelming power. They submitted. That choice isn't hard to understand. Submission offered survival, at least in the short term. It meant giving earth and water, symbols of loyalty, paying tribute, and accepting Persian authority in exchange for being left standing. But other states looked at the same approaching empire and saw something else: the end of self-rule, the end of local law, the end of being able to decide your own future. For Athens, it threatened something newer and more fragile: democracy. Not modern democracy. Athenian democracy excluded many people, but still a revolutionary idea for its time, that political authority could be argued, voted, and shared among citizens, rather than handed down as divine right. So the Greeks who chose resistance formed a coalition we now call the Hellenic League. It was fragile, it was political, it was full of arguments, but it was real. And in a moment of crisis, leadership of the land forces fell to the one city almost everyone agreed was the strongest military power in Greece: Sparta. Now, a modern audience sometimes expects the Greek plan to be simple: meet Persia and fight. But the Greeks understood something that still holds true today. If your enemy is bigger, you don't meet them where they're strongest. You change the shape of the fight. That's where Thermopylae comes in. Thermopylae was an Athenian statesman and strategist, less a heroic warrior and more the kind of person modern history is filled with: a systems thinker, a man who sees infrastructure and geography as weapons. He argued for a joint operation, land and sea, because Persia's greatest advantage wasn't only numbers on land, it was the combination of a large army and a powerful navy. The fleet could supply the land army, support its movement, and potentially outflank any fixed defense. So Thermopylae proposed a paired choke point strategy: block the Persian army at a narrow pass on land, and at the same time, block the Persian fleet in a narrow strait at sea. Force Persia to fight in places where size becomes congestion, and where discipline and coordination can outperform mass. For the land defense, the Greeks chose Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, named for the local sulfur springs. In that era, the pass was much narrower than it is today, squeezed tightly between mountain and sea. It was exactly the kind of terrain that turns numbers into a disadvantage. For the sea, the Greeks positioned their fleet near Artemisium, and later, more famously, at Salamis, where narrow waters could trap a larger navy in its own crowding. This was asymmetry before modern textbooks ever named it. Of course, even with a good plan, there were complications. Greek city-states didn't only answer to strategy, they answered to religion and tradition. Sacred festivals shaped calendars, laws shaped what could be done and when. And so Greece found itself trying to respond to an invasion while major religious events were underway. For Sparta, this mattered especially. Spartan law restricted large-scale military action during the Carneia, a sacred festival. Caught between ritual obligation and existential threat, Sparta chose a compromise. They couldn't send the full army immediately, but they would send a force under one of their kings, Leonidas, enough to anchor the defense and signal that the coalition would fight. In practical terms, it bought time. In symbolic terms, it told Greece and Persia alike Sparta was committed. And for Xerxes, that kind of message was dangerous, because if the Greeks truly believed resistance was possible, then conquest wouldn't be cheap, it wouldn't be automatic. This is where part 2 of the story ends, with the pieces in motion. Xerxes is crossing into Europe with an army so large it reshapes the landscape around it. Greek city-states are choosing sides, some submitting, some resisting. A fragile alliance is trying to hold together long enough to fight like one. And Thermopylae is doing what modern strategists still do, selecting battlefields where the enemy cannot use its full strength. The hot gates and the narrow straits aren't just locations, they're ideas, proof that geography can be turned into a weapon, and that the outcome of a war can hinge on choosing where the fight happens. Because in the days ahead, the Greeks won't try to match Persia's power, they'll try to deny it.
Sparta didn't raise boys the way most places do. Sparta forged them. And if you want the real story behind Thermopylae, behind Leonidas, behind the men who held the hot gates, you have to hold two truths at the same time. Spartan discipline was absolutely real, but Spartan strength also came with a cost that modern eyes can't ignore, because their society depended on harsh control at home as much as courage on the battlefield. That tension is part of what makes Thermopylae so powerful and so complicated. In most Greek cities, politics was an argument in public. In Athens, people were experimenting with democracy, philosophy, art, trying to figure out what a citizen could be. Sparta went in a different direction. Sparta built an entire system around one goal: military readiness. It wasn't just that Spartans respected warriors, the state was designed to produce them. From early childhood, a Spartan boy belonged less to his family and more to the city. The famous training system, the agoge, wasn't a weekend program or a phase. It was a complete re-engineering of identity. Boys were pushed into hardship on purpose, not because Sparta misunderstood compassion, but because Sparta believed comfort was a threat. If you can endure hunger, cold, and fear while you're young, you won't break when real crisis arrives. They were trained to move together, to obey quickly, to hold position when every instinct says to step away. They learned weapons, of course, but the deeper lesson was this: the individual is not the unit, the formation is. That's why Spartan warfare, especially the phalanx, worked. It required trust so strong that you would risk your life for the man beside you without thinking. The shield wasn't just protection for your own body, it protected the line. A shield dropped wasn't only personal panic, it was a gap that endangered everyone. Spartans' culture reinforced that idea relentlessly. Courage was celebrated. Cowardice wasn't just criticized, it was socially fatal. A man who fled a fight could be shunned, avoided, treated like a ghost walking through his own city. And for many, that fear of social exile was more powerful than the fear of dying. Even Spartan speech was shaped by the same discipline. They became famous for short, sharp phrases, what we now call laconic, after Laconia, their homeland. No long speeches, no excess, just meaning delivered like a blade. Spartan women were also unusual in the Greek world. They were more educated than most of their contemporaries, more physically trained, and had greater public presence. Not because Sparta was modern, but because Sparta was practical. The city believed strong mothers produced strong sons. It was a society where the private and the political were welded together. Now, here's the part we have to confront, especially if we're looking at this with a modern lens. Spartan's system didn't run on discipline alone. It ran on labor. A large portion of the population were helots, people bound to the land, compelled to work, exploited so that Spartan citizens could devote themselves to training. In other words, Spartan freedom for a few was made possible by unfreedom for many. That doesn't erase the courage at Thermopylae, but it does change the way we interpret the slogans. When Greek writers later framed the Persian War as freedom versus tyranny, the reality was messier. Athens had democracy for citizens, yes. Sparta had a militarized oligarchy. Persia was an empire, often harsh in war, but also sophisticated in administration, frequently ruling through local elites and allowing cultural diversity. History rarely gives us pure moral binaries. Thermopylae survives because it's inspiring, but it also forces us to ask what kind of freedom people were actually defending, and for whom. Leonidas was shaped by this Spartan world, but he wasn't simply a soldier in a training program. He was also a king, and in Sparta, kings were not absolute rulers. Sparta famously had a dual kingship, 2 royal lines, 2 kings at once. Power was balanced by councils and elders. That structure mattered when Persia approached because it meant every decision had layers: law, tradition, politics, religion. And then timing made everything worse. The Persian invasion came during a sacred festival in Sparta, the Carneia. Spartan law restricted major military operations during that period. At the same time, Greek attention was also pulled toward the Olympic Games. In a modern society, we might see that as an inconvenience. In the ancient world, it was the operating system of public life. Religion wasn't a separate category. It was embedded in law, legitimacy, and identity. So Sparta faced a brutal contradiction. Sacred law said wait, and reality said move now. Their compromise was decisive and chilling in its clarity. They would send Leonidas north immediately with a small elite detachment, his royal guard of 300. And it's worth slowing down here because the legend often distorts what that number means. It's true, 300 Spartans marched with Leonidas, but Thermopylae was not defended by only 300 men. Thousands of Greeks assembled there, Spartans at the core, but also Thespians, Phocians, Thebans, and others. Thermopylae was a coalition stand, not a solo performance. Still, those 300 were carefully chosen, not rookies, veterans. Herodotus gives us one detail that lands differently when you say it out loud. Leonidas chose men who already had sons. In other words, he selected soldiers whose family lines would continue if they did not return. That doesn't prove Leonidas planned to die, but it does suggest he understood the risk clearly. It suggests he treated the mission as something closer to a delaying action than a conventional battle where victory was likely. Before leaving, Leonidas consulted Delphi. The oracle's message, however it was phrased, carried a simple meaning. Either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king would die. Ancient prophecy often works like this. It doesn't force one future, it narrows the emotional space. It tells you what the cost might be, and then it watches whether you accept it. For Leonidas, raised in Spartan duty and trained to see leadership as sacrifice, the prophecy wasn't an argument, it was a confirmation of what he already suspected.
From a modern perspective, this is where Leonidas becomes especially interesting, because we tend to imagine ancient leaders as either cynical politicians or fearless heroes. Leonidas doesn't fit neatly into either category. He appears to be something closer to what modern military leadership training tries to create, a person who can look directly at a likely loss and still act with clarity, not because he's thrilled by danger, but because he believes the mission matters more than the self. That isn't romantic, it's heavy. So Leonidas marched north. As he moved, more Greeks joined him along the road. Not everyone believed the alliance would hold. Not everyone trusted Sparta, not everyone trusted Athens. But the fact that Leonidas showed up at all, on time, in person, sent a message stronger than any speech. It said the strongest land army in Greece is here. It said resistance is not just theoretical. It said if we're going to stand together, the place to do it is where geography favors us. And that brings us back to Thermopylae itself. A narrow corridor between mountain and sea, a place that denies flanking, denies mass maneuver, denies the most basic advantage of an empire, the ability to spread out and overwhelm. Leonidas wasn't planning to defeat Persia in the open, he was planning to hold a doorway. And while the poets would later turn that into a pure legend, the real story is already dramatic enough. A leader shaped by a harsh system, carrying a prophecy like a weight, marching into a choke point with a small elite guard, while the fate of an alliance and the future of Greece tightened around that narrow strip of road. Because at Thermopylae, the question was never, can we destroy the Persian army? The question was, can we hold long enough for Greece to keep fighting?
Thermopylae, in the year 480 BC, was narrower than most people imagine today. Coastlines change, rivers dump silt. The land slowly rewrites the map. But back then, the hot gates were a true choke point, sometimes only a few dozen meters wide, pinched hard between steep mountain slopes on one side and the sea on the other. It wasn't just a place to stand, it was a place designed, by nature, to deny an enemy the one advantage Persia seemed to have in endless supply: room. When Leonidas reached the pass, he didn't treat it like a stage, he treated it like a job site. The Greeks moved fast. They repaired an older barrier, often called the Phocian Wall, tightening the narrowest point of the corridor into something that could be held by disciplined heavy infantry. They set camp, stacked shields, checked spear shafts, tightened straps, and made the pass feel less like a road and more like a locked door. At the center of the defense were the hoplites, the heavy infantry of the Greek world. These were not lightly equipped skirmishers, they were built for close pressure. A large round shield, a long spear, armor that turned you into a moving piece of metal and leather. And the real weapon wasn't any single item, it was the formation. The phalanx. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, forming a continuous wall, spears projected forward in tight ranks. If you've never seen a disciplined unit move as one, it's hard to grasp how intimidating it is, not because it looks wild, but because it looks controlled, like a single creature that doesn't panic. That was Leonidas's plan: use the geography to compress the Persians into a narrow front, then use cohesion, training, discipline, and equipment to hold them there. Soon, the Persian army arrived. From the Greek position, it would have looked like the world was filling up. Banners, horses, armor, torch smoke, an ocean of men stretching farther than any local imagination could comfortably hold. And above it all was the sense of certainty that empires bring with them, the belief that the outcome is already decided. Xerxes set himself up to watch. Ancient accounts describe him on a hill with something like a throne. Whether it was a literal throne or a formal command position doesn't really change the point. This was theater as much as war. Xerxes wanted everyone to see him as the center of the event. And then, he waited. The sources tell us he held back for several days, often described as 4, almost as if he expected the Greeks to come to their senses. From a modern perspective, that pause is fascinating. It suggests Xerxes believed intimidation might win without the cost of a full assault. It also suggests he preferred the cheaper victory. Empires don't love risk, they love predictability. During this time, he sent demands: surrender, hand over weapons, submit to Persian authority. There's a famous Spartan reply associated with this moment, molon labe, usually translated as, come and take them. It's a line often linked more strongly to later writers than to the earliest sources, but it captures something real about Spartan posture. Not loud defiance, not a speech, just refusal. And the Greeks added a kind of deliberate insult, though insult might be too small a word. They behaved as if they had all the time in the world. They exercised, they checked gear, they groomed themselves. Spartans combing their hair before battle wasn't vanity, it was ritual, a way of telling the enemy, and telling their own bodies, that fear was not in charge. Xerxes could handle anger, he could handle direct challenge. What he wasn't used to was being denied the psychological victory first. The pass stayed quiet.
The Greeks didn't move, and that silence began to scrape against the emperor's pride. Now, there's something important happening here that a lot of simplified retellings miss. Thermopylae was never only a land battle. It was part of a system. Themistocles' larger strategy depended on holding the sea as well as the pass. If the Persian fleet could sail freely down the coast, it could resupply the land army, land forces behind the Greeks, and turn Thermopylae from a defensive door into a trap. So while Leonidas held the pass corridor, Greek ships fought in nearby waters around Artemisium. Those sea battles were hard, complicated, and less clean in storytelling than a narrow pass. Naval actions always are, but they were crucial. Thermopylae only mattered if the sea line didn't collapse instantly. In modern language, this was joint operations, land and sea treated as one campaign, not two separate stories. Themistocles understood that. Leonidas benefited from it. And while kings were testing each other's patience on land, another kind of danger was taking shape above the pass, quiet, local, and deadly. There was a mountain track, the Anopia path, that could bypass Thermopylae and come down behind the Greek position. This wasn't a magical secret, it was local terrain knowledge. Leonidas knew about it. Greek commanders knew about it. That's why a guard force, usually described as Phocians, was stationed up there. This is the kind of detail that makes Thermopylae feel modern, because it reminds us that even the best defensive plan can be undone by a single vulnerability. Not always by strength, sometimes by information, timing, and one weak point that doesn't get enough attention. Somewhere in the hills, a man like Ephialtes exists at the edge of the story, close enough to know the path, close enough to know that knowledge has value, and close enough to sense that an empire would pay for the right whisper at the right moment. Meanwhile, Xerxes' patience wears thin. Days of waiting can be useful. They can also be humiliating, especially for a ruler who believes obedience should come naturally. And so eventually, Xerxes makes the decision that feels inevitable. If intimidation won't move them, force will. The moment Xerxes gives the order to begin, the tone changes in an instant. It's the difference between a storm on the horizon and the first drop of rain. You can feel the air shift. Persian troops begin to form up. Signals pass down the lines. Archers prepare. Infantry tightens ranks. On the Greek side, the response is quiet. Shields are raised. Spear points align. Men adjust their feet on the stone and gravel, making micro-corrections the way trained fighters do. Small changes that decide whether you hold or slip. Leonidas moves along the line, not delivering speeches, not performing, just confirming that the structure is sound, that the wall is a wall, that every man knows where to stand, how to brace, when to rotate. Because this is what Thermopylae really is at its core. Not a fantasy of invincible heroes, but a brutal test of systems. A narrow pass that punishes crowding, a disciplined formation that rewards cohesion, an empire that expects fear to do its work, a coalition that's trying to become one people before it gets crushed, and above it all an overlooked path in the mountains, waiting like a question no one wants to answer. As the first Persian lines advance, the hot gates stop being just geography, they become a decision made visible. And once that decision is visible, the story can't be undone, only endured.
Dawn at the hot gates doesn't arrive with celebration. It arrives like a verdict. The sky turns from black to iron gray, and the narrow road between mountain and sea begins to show its true shape, tight, pinched, unforgiving. The rebuilt wall sits like a stitched wound across the pass, and behind it, the Greek line stands so still it's hard to tell where the men end and the stone begins. Far beyond the bend, the Persian host is already moving. From a distance, it looks like the horizon itself is shifting. Banners, spear points, the slow roll of an army that has crossed continents and expects the world to step aside. Somewhere above, on his hillside terrace, Xerxes watches the corridor with the calm of a man who believes he is witnessing the last moments of resistance. Then his hand rises. Not dramatically, just once, clean and decisive. The first message of the empire is not steel, it is sound, drums, horns, commands carried down the line. The Persian archers step forward, rows deep, and the air seems to tighten as thousands of bowstrings draw back at the same time. For a heartbeat, everything pauses, and then the sky fills. The volley doesn't block out the sun the way later storytellers like to say, but it is dense enough to make you understand why someone would speak that way. Arrows lift in a dark curve, carried by the physics of the draw and the wind, and then they fall toward the wall in a rush of motion. Behind the stones, Leonidas doesn't shout. He doesn't need to. His signal is small, barely a movement of the arm. The shields rise together. Wood and bronze overlap into a single surface, a roof of protection that turns the volley into noise and vibration.
You can feel the impacts through the line, the thud, the rattle, the quick tremor that runs from shield edge into forearm and shoulder. Some arrows bite into wood, others glance away, skittering off at sharp angles, dropping into the gravel or tumbling toward the sea. The Greek line holds. No panic, no scattered movement, just a controlled breath and a steady stance. From Xerxes' Hill, it is the first irritation of the morning. He had expected fear. He had expected men to flinch. Instead, the Greeks absorb the storm like a wall takes rain. So the empire changes its question. Archers step back, officers move forward. The infantry begins its advance. Troops Herodotus associates with the Medes and the Scythians, experienced soldiers who have won battles before, pushing down the narrow corridor with orders to seize the line and bring prisoners to the king. They march into the hot gates, and the pass begins to do what it was born to do. It compresses them. The front ranks move well enough at first, but as the corridor narrows, bodies crowd bodies, shields bump, steps shorten. The rear keeps pushing because the rear cannot see what the front is truly facing. Momentum becomes pressure. Pressure becomes a kind of trapped force. And then the first wave meets the Greek formation. It isn't a cinematic charge, it's a collision of structure against structure, shield against shield, spear points searching for space, feet digging into stone and gravel so the line doesn't slide backward. The Greeks don't break into individual fights. They don't chase. They don't spread out. They do what Sparta trained them to do, and what their allies have been prepared to copy. They hold shape. Spears move in short, disciplined strokes from behind the safety of the shield wall. Forward, retract, reset. Each motion driven by hips and shoulders, not by wild swings. The phalanx doesn't need drama. It needs rhythm. For the Persians, that rhythm is a problem. Their strength, numbers, can't fully express itself here. Only a limited front can engage at any moment, and everyone behind that front is effectively waiting in line. That's what makes the hot gates feel like a machine. It turns the largest army in the world into something smaller, simply by denying it room. Leonidas watches the line the way a builder watches a structure under strain. He looks for microsigns, a shield tilting too low, a man's footing slipping, a spear angle drifting. When he moves just enough. One step to the side, one touch on a shield rim, a brief signal down the ranks. He is not inspiring them with speeches. He is maintaining the integrity of a system, and the system holds. Hours pass in pulses. Advance, impact, retreat, advance again. The Persian line presses forward, is checked, reset, then presses again. Each time the same problem returns. The corridor will not widen for them. It will not let them surround. It will not let them flood. By midday, something else becomes clear, something modern soldiers would recognize instantly. The Greeks are managing fatigue better. They are rotating. One unit steps back, another steps forward, a clean exchange performed without dropping shields or opening gaps. In the resting line, men drink water, reset helmets, tighten straps, flex fingers to keep feeling in their hands. Then when the signal comes, they return to the front, fresh enough to keep the rhythm unbroken. That rotation is quiet brilliance. It turns endurance into an advantage. It stretches the Greeks' limited numbers into time, and time in this battle is currency. From Xerxes' Hill, the scene becomes harder to interpret. He sees wave after wave sent into the pass, and he does not see the Greeks collapse the way they're supposed to. He sees a line that bends just enough to survive, then stiffens again. The longer it goes, the more the battle becomes psychological. Because if the Greeks can do this here, if they can turn the empire's strength into inconvenience, then the story Persia brought to Greece begins to crack. Not the reality of Persian power, but the assumption of effortless victory. As afternoon fades toward evening, the attacks finally slacken. The Persians pull back in organized groups, carrying the exhausted, reforming, looking for orders that might change the shape of the problem. On the Greek side, the line remains intact. Men lower shields carefully. They don't celebrate. They don't run forward. They simply reset. Campfires bloom behind the wall. Smoke rises into the sea wind. A medic checks bruised shoulders and strained wrists. Spears are examined. Straps are replaced. Water skins are passed down the line. There's talk, but not much. Not because they're fearless, but because they understand the day isn't over in a meaningful sense. They've won something far more precious than ground. They've won time. In the Persian camp, the mood is different. The fires are brighter, the conversations sharper. Officers count what was spent and what was gained. Scribes scratch tallies on tablets. Messengers move between tents. Xerxes withdraws into lamplight and smoke, where maps are spread on tables, and the pass is reduced to a narrow line of ink. And there, in the quiet of his pavilion, you can almost hear the question forming in his mind. Not, how do I defeat them? He believes he will defeat them. The question is, how do I stop paying this price? He traces the corridor on the map with a finger. He pauses at the choke point. He presses down, as if pressure on paper could widen stone. Then his finger begins to drift, upward, toward the mountains. Because an empire doesn't only conquer with force, it conquers with options, with routes, with information. Outside, the hot gates continue to breathe. Steam curls across the stones in slow waves. Torches hiss in the wind. The sea keeps its own quiet rhythm, indifferent. On the Greek wall, sentries pace and scan the road ahead, their attention fixed forward where the next assault must come from. Behind them, the men who rotated out of the line try to sleep with armor close and shields with reach, because they know morning will bring another test. And on the Persian hill, Xerxes stares into the darkness, trying to reclaim the feeling of inevitability that Thermopylae has begun to steal from him. By the time the first pale light returns, both sides will be ready again. But something has changed. The first day has proven that the hot gates can hold, not forever, not against every possibility, but long enough to matter, long enough to disrupt the empire's schedule, long enough for Greece to keep breathing. And in war, schedule is strategy. As dawn approaches for the second time, banners lift in the wind, helmets settle onto heads, and hands tighten on spear shafts. The door is still closed. The empire is still outside it. And everyone, Greek and Persian alike, now understands the same uncomfortable truth. Thermopylae is not going to be taken quickly.
When night falls after the first day at Thermopylae, the hot gates don't feel like a road anymore. They feel like a pressure chamber. The torches burn lower. The sea turns black. Steam from the springs drifts across the stones in pale ribbons, and in that half-light, you can see what the day has done. Not in heroic speeches, but in posture. The Greeks stay tight behind their wall, checking straps, rotating sentries, moving with that quiet, efficient discipline that says, "We're still here." On the Persian side, the mood is sharper. Xerxes did not come to Greece to spend days being delayed by a few thousand men in a narrow corridor. Empires can tolerate many things. They can tolerate setbacks, they can tolerate the weather, but they struggle to tolerate public defiance, especially defiance that works. So Xerxes escalates. He doesn't send another ordinary wave. He calls for his elite, the force the Greeks will later describe with a name that sounds almost supernatural: the Immortals. The legend around that name is simple and powerful: an undying unit, forever the same strength. In reality, it was something more practical and more frightening: a professional corps kept at a constant number. If a man fell ill or was lost, he was replaced immediately. To outsiders, it could look like the unit never shrank, like it couldn't be worn down. And Xerxes wants that image back. He wants a clean ending. He wants the story of Thermopylae to shift from unexpected resistance to inevitable submission. So in the torchlit lanes of the Persian camp, the elite ranks assemble, armor tightened, spears aligned, cloaks settling against the night wind. Their commander, often identified in the sources as Hydarnes, moves with the calm of a man who expects his orders to be completed. The Immortals march toward the pass like a dark river of torches. From the Greek wall, the sound reaches them first: the measured footfalls, the low murmur of an organized column,
the subtle creak of leather and metal. Leonidas walks his line. He doesn't need to raise his voice. He doesn't need to promise glory. The men know what their job is. Hold. And holding in a place like Thermopylae is not romantic. It is physical. Its feet locked into gravel so the line doesn't slide. Its shoulders braced so the shield edge doesn't open a gap. Its breathing controlled so panic doesn't steal oxygen from your muscles. When the immortals enter the hot gates, they meet the same problem the rest of Xerxes' army met. Geometry. The pass doesn't care that these are elite troops. It doesn't widen out of respect. It doesn't provide space because a king demanded it. In a narrow corridor, only so many men can fight at once. That means a massive army can't fully express its mass. It has to feed itself into the front in a limited stream. And if the front doesn't break, the back becomes a waiting room. That's the hidden cruelty of Thermopylae for the Persians. Their numbers become congestion. The immortals push in with disciplined force, trying to drive the Greeks back through momentum and pressure. They are better equipped than the first waves, better organized, better commanded. But they still have to do the impossible, break a well-formed phalanx in a space where flanking isn't possible. The Greeks absorb them like they absorb the rest. You don't see a chaotic brawl here. You see structure under strain. Spears thrust in short, efficient motion. Shields grind and saddle. Boots slip half an inch on whetstones and then recover. The line bends slightly, then straightens again. The Greeks rotate their front ranks even under this pressure. One line steps back, another steps forward, as if the defense itself has gears. It keeps them fresh. It keeps the wall sharp. It drains the attacker while preserving the defender. From Xerxes' viewpoint on the hill above, it looks impossible. The stories say he rose from his seat in frustration, more than once. Whether he literally jumped up or not, the emotional truth is believable. A ruler who expects obedience is not prepared to watch disobedience survive. And that's the deeper thing happening here. Xerxes isn't just losing men. He's losing certainty. The longer the immortals struggle, the more the question shifts in Xerxes' mind. Not who is stronger. He knows his empire is stronger in the open. The question becomes, why is this narrow place stronger than my army? Once that question appears, a new kind of strategy begins. Because if brute force can't open the door quickly, you start looking for another door. You start looking for information. This is where empires reveal both their strength and their weakness. Their strength is resources, the ability to buy, recruit, threaten, and search. Their weakness is that they often lack honest feedback. Bad news gets softened. Problems get described as temporary. Officers fear disappointing the top, so they bring answers instead of questions. Thermopylae forces questions, and Xerxes starts asking the most dangerous one of all. Is there another way through? To a modern viewer, this is the moment where the battle stops being only about courage and begins to look like what wars usually are, contests of logistics and intelligence. How you move, what you know, who you can persuade, which paths you can exploit. Somewhere above the pass, there is a mountain trail, an old track through woods and rock that can bypass the hot gates and come down behind the Greek line. The Greeks know it exists. That's why they stationed guards up there. But knowing a risk exists and being able to neutralize it are not the same thing. At sea, Themistocles is dealing with the same reality in a different form. Around Artemisium, the Greek fleet struggles to hold position. Storms batter ships, crews tire. The sea doesn't care about plans any more than the pass does. But Themistocles understands that this naval front is part of the same clock. Thermopylae buys time. Artemisium holds the hinge. If the sea collapses too quickly, the land defense becomes meaningless. So Themistocles is not chasing a clean victory at this stage. He's buying time, just as Leonidas is buying time. Time for evacuations, time for political unity, time for the next move. Back on land, night deepens. The immortals withdraw and regroup. Their elite discipline remains intact, but their aura has been dented. A unit that is supposed to be unstoppable has been stopped by a wall of shields and the stubbornness of stone geography. In the Persian camp, torches flicker in long lanes. Officers speak quietly, scribes tally and report. Xerxes retreats into lamplight and smoke, where the pass becomes ink on parchment, and the problem becomes something he can touch with a fingertip. He traces the narrow corridor on the map. He pauses at the choke point. Then he drifts upward toward the mountains, as if the paper itself might reveal what the land is hiding. And as he searches for a solution, a new danger enters the story, because information doesn't only come from scouts. Sometimes it comes from locals, from men who know the hills, from men who live close to the paths that kings forget exist. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp,
Ephialtes is listening to the same question Xerxes has begun to ask. He lives in the kind of place where empires and alliances both feel distant, and survival feels personal. He knows that when great forces collide, small people can become valuable, if they hold the right secret. Xerxes wants a door. Ephialtes knows a path. And the hot gates, still breathing steam into the night air, are about to learn that the most dangerous weapon on a battlefield is not always a spear. Sometimes it's a route.
Ephialtes is not a monster in the way stories like to make traitors. He doesn't arrive with glowing eyes or a villain's speech. He doesn't look like a nightmare. He looks like a man from the hills, someone you could pass on a road and forget moments later. And that's exactly what makes him dangerous. Because real turning points in history often don't come from dramatic figures in crowns. They come from ordinary people standing at the edge of great events, holding a small piece of leverage and deciding what to do with it. Ephialtes was a local from the region around Thermopylae. Herodotus names him as Ephialtes of Trachis, a man who knew the mountain paths the way sailors know currents, a man who lived far from the political speeches about freedom and honor and close to the harder math of daily survival. In a moment like this, those two worlds collide. On one side, the Greek alliance talks about duty and sacrifice, about holding the line so Greece can remain itself. On the other side, an empire arrives with the kind of power that makes local choices feel tiny. Xerxes doesn't just bring soldiers, he brings money, he brings promises, he brings consequences. Gold changes the moral weather. So Ephialtes makes his move. He goes to the Persian camp, not as a warrior, not as a messenger of war, as a seller. He offers Xerxes something far more valuable than another wave of troops, an option, a way around the wall, a path that turns Thermopylae from a locked door into a doorframe you can walk around. The route is called the Oenopeia path, a mountain track that winds above the hot gates and descends behind the Greek position. Here's the crucial detail. Leonidas knew this path existed. The Greeks knew it existed. That's why they stationed guards up there, Phocian troops in most accounts. So the failure wasn't ignorance. The failure was how vulnerable any plan becomes when it depends on one thin line of defense, one guard force, one assumption, one moment of confusion in the dark. Xerxes listens to Ephialtes, and the emotional temperature changes immediately. You can almost feel the relief, not the relief of mercy, relief of efficiency, the relief of a ruler who has found a cheaper way to victory. He acts fast. He sends his commander, often identified as Hydarnes, along with a detachment of elite troops to follow Ephialtes through the mountains under cover of night. No grand announcement, no speeches, just movement. And that's how history really turns, more often than we want to admit, not with declarations, but with quiet footsteps where no one is watching. The detachment climbs through darkness. Leaves whisper in the wind, armor creaks softly, men breathe carefully to stay silent. They move through a world that feels older than war itself, pines, stone, fog, and the steady pulse of the mountain. Just before dawn, they reach the Phocian guard post. Herodotus gives us a detail that feels almost cinematic. The rustling of leaves was the first warning the Phocian had. You can imagine it, sentries half awake, the forest suddenly sounding wrong, the fog shifting. They react quickly. There's confusion, a brief exchange of arrows, and then the Phocians make the decision that changes everything. They retreat uphill. From their perspective, it makes sense. They assume they're the target. They move to higher ground to hold a defensive position. They're thinking like soldiers trying to survive an assault. But they misread the mission. The Persians aren't there to fight them. They're there to bypass them. So the Persians ignore the Phocians and continue down the path, leaving the defenders on the hill watching the main force slip past like a shadow. In modern military terms, it's the kind of failure that keeps commanders awake for the rest of their lives. You respond to contact as if it's an attack, when it's actually a diversion. A Phocian messenger breaks away and runs downhill toward Leonidas. And while he runs, the hot gates are changing shape, not physically, but tactically. Thermopylae is no longer a doorway with one front, it's becoming a trap. When the messenger reaches Leonidas, the report is simple and devastating. Persians are coming behind us. Leonidas listens without drama, no outburst, no disbelief, just the stillness of someone who understands the reality immediately. He calls a council. Allied commanders gather behind the wall. The conversation is tense, fast, and human. Some argue for withdrawal at once. It's not cowardice, it's logic. The Greek alliance cannot afford to lose its entire field force in a single enclosed corridor. Thermopylae was never meant to hold forever. It was meant to delay. It was meant to buy time. And by holding for 2 days, they've already achieved something significant. They've forced the empire to bleed time. They've proven the Persians can be delayed. They've given the rest of Greece a chance to prepare. Now the priority is survival of the larger force. If the alliance is wiped out here, the war ends in a week. Leonidas agrees. He orders most of the allied troops to withdraw while they still can.
This isn't surrender, it's strategy, a fighting retreat carried out early enough to avoid chaos. But then comes the second part of the decision, the part that creates the legend. Someone has to stay, because an organized withdrawal only works if the enemy is held back long enough for the column to escape. If everyone retreats at once, the withdrawal becomes a crush of bodies, then a collapse of order, and then a pursuit. Leonidas knows the rear must be anchored by men who will not panic, men who will hold even when they understand the outcome. And he also knows something else, something the oracle at Delphi already pressed into his mind. The story demands a king. For a Spartan king, retreating from this kind of position would not only be a military choice, it would be a political fracture, a shame that could echo back home and break the unity Spartan needs to survive whatever comes next. So Leonidas stays. His 300 Spartans stay with him, and in one of the most overlooked acts of courage in the entire story, the Thespians stay too, around 700 men led by Thermopylae. They are not compelled by Spartan law, they are not bound by Spartan politics, they choose it. In modern terms, their decision is staggering. It means they see the value of the delay and are willing to pay for it with their lives, not for personal glory, but because they believe the coalition matters. The Thespians are the more complicated part of the story. Ancient sources suggest they were not fully committed to the Greek cause. Some accounts imply they were kept close to Leonidas as leverage and later surrendered. Whether every detail is accurate or not, their presence reminds us that Greek unity was never perfect. Even at Thermopylae, politics was in the room. As the retreat begins, the pass fills with the sound of departing feet. Banners lower. Units move south, one after another, trying to keep order, trying not to look back too long. The rear guard stays by the wall, resetting their stance, checking straps, tightening formation. Not loud, not theatrical, just ready. Some later traditions put a famous line in Leonidas' mouth. Eat well, because tonight we dine in Hades. Whether he said that exact phrase or not, it captures the mood. Not despair, not excitement, acceptance. At the same time, Xerxes finally had what he wanted, a door around the door. But even as he receives the news that the path has worked, he doesn't get the clean satisfaction he expected, because a part of him understands what this means. He didn't break the Greeks head on. He had to buy a way around them. An empire can call that strategy. A ruler who believes his power is absolute experiences it as a stain. And now, as dawn brightens over the hot gates, the board is set for the final phase. Persians will press from the front. Elites will descend from behind. Leonidas and those who remain will hold as long as they can, not to win the battlefield, but to preserve the war. Because Thermopylae is no longer about whether the pass can be held. It's about whether the Greek alliance can survive long enough to fight again. And that makes the next day, for the men who stayed, not a quest for victory, but a deliberate trade. Their time for Greece's future.
Morning at Thermopylae arrives without ceremony. No horns announce it for the Greeks, no messenger brings comfort. The sun simply rises over the cliffs, pale and indifferent, and the hot gates look almost ordinary again. Stone, scrub, and that thin strip of road trapped between mountain and sea. But Leonidas knows the truth. Overnight, the battlefield changed shape. The Persians didn't just press from the front anymore, they found a way around. So Leonidas chooses where the last hours will be spent. Not in the tightest throat of the pass, where pressure from both ends would crush the defenders too quickly, but slightly farther out, where the ground opens just enough to buy seconds. Just enough space to move a shield, to reposition a rank, to keep the retreat from turning into a rout. That's the real work of command now, not how to win, but how to control the cost of losing. Behind the rebuilt wall, the Allied troops begin to withdraw, not in panic, not in shame, in order. They move south in disciplined columns, helping the exhausted, steadying carts and supplies, keeping banners low so they don't snag on rock or wind. It's the kind of retreat that looks almost boring, until you realize how rare it is for an army under threat to leave without breaking. This is what Leonidas has purchased with the first 2 days at Thermopylae, time enough for the rest of Greece to remain intact. And still, as those allies disappear into the misted road, the pass feels emptier in a way that hits the chest. It's one thing to plan a rear guard on a map. It's another thing to watch the main force walk away while you remain. Leonidas turns back to his men. The Spartans are there, 300, veterans, steady as the wall itself. And beside them stand the Thespians, led by Thermopylae, who chose to stay even though no Spartan law compelled them. They could have lived, they chose to remain anyway. That choice matters. Not for poetry, but for truth. Thermopylae is not only a Spartan story, it's also a story about people deciding, voluntarily, to hold the door for others. The air is damp. Steam from the springs drifts low across the stones. The wind carries salt from the sea. Shields are raised and settled again, straps tightened, grips checked. Everything is efficient, minimal.
No speeches, no theatrical vows, just men setting their bodies into the shape their duty requires. From above, on his terrace, Xerxes watches with a kind of cold focus. He sees the withdrawal. He sees the smaller force remaining. He knows the pass will finally open, and yet he does not get the clean satisfaction he wanted. Something about this resistance has left a mark, not because it threatens the empire's final outcome in the short term, but because it proves the empire can be delayed, and delay is expensive. At the same time, behind the Greek position, movement stirs in the fog. The mountain trail, the hidden route, now carries elite troops down into the rear of the pass. Their boots find whetstone and leaf. Their spacing stays tight. Their discipline is quiet and professional. And there, close to them but never truly among them, is Ephialtes, hooded, tense, keeping distance. He has delivered the secret. Now he stands near the machinery of empire, and the closer you are to power, the clearer it becomes. Power doesn't embrace you. It uses you. Leonidas doesn't need to see Ephialtes to feel the trap closing. He can sense it in the way sound behaves in the pass, in the faint echo of movement where there shouldn't be any, in the way his captains glance back, just once, then force their eyes forward again. Now the third day begins for real. The Persians advance from the front in steady ranks. Banners push into the corridor. Officers signal with small gestures. The narrow ground compresses their formation again, as it always has. But this time, geometry is no longer Leonidas's havre, because geometry is closing from both directions. Leonidas makes the only choice left to him. He does not remain passively behind the wall and wait to be sealed in. He pushes forward into the slightly wider space, forcing the front engagement to happen where the rear guard can still maneuver, where they can still take controlled steps, where they can still keep shape. In modern terms, it's a brutal clarity. If you're going to be surrounded, you choose where the circle tightens. You choose the ground that buys the most seconds. You choose the terrain that lets you delay, not collapse. The clash is close. It's exhausting. It's not cinematic in the way later centuries will paint it. No elegant duels, no clean lines, just bodies and shields and the relentless reality of limited space. You feel it in the small details. Boots sliding a fraction on damp gravel, then correcting. A shoulder taking the full weight of a shield impact, then resetting. A spear shaft flexing under pressure, then being pulled back and braced again. And slowly the other pressure arrives. The rear detachment closes in from behind. For the defenders, options vanish one by one. Breaking out requires open space. There isn't any. Surrender requires trust in an enemy's terms. And in this moment, trust is a luxury no one can afford. So what remains is the one thing Sparta trained for, and the Thespians chose knowingly. Hold, delay, endure. Leonidas stays where the enemy can see him, not because he's chasing glory, but because the center matters. When the center holds, the line holds. When the center wavers, fear spreads like fire. Then, amid the pressure and noise and shifting ground, Leonidas goes down. Not in a staged moment designed for an audience, in the way leaders fall in real fights, suddenly surrounded by motion, partially obscured, the body giving way under a force too great to absorb. There is no time for grief. The men around him tighten immediately. Formation closes like a fist. Shields lift. The line compresses. Because whether or not they can carry him, whether or not they can protect him, the deeper rule of this moment is symbolic as well as tactical. The king cannot simply be abandoned. The story of the battle will be told later, and what happens now will become part of the message. The defenders begin to backstep towards a small rocky rise, higher ground, a place where final perimeter can be formed. This withdrawal is controlled. It is not a break. It is a deliberate shrinking of space, turning their last remaining strength, cohesion, into one final delay. They reach the rise and form a tight ring. Shields wedge against stone. Spear points settle into place. Men crouch and brace. Shoulders squared. Jaws set. Eyes forward. And now the Persians do what armies often do when they want to end a stubborn pocket without paying for it up close. They call up archers. The wind shifts. Bows rise. Bowstrings draw back. And for a moment, time stretches in a way that feels armreal, like the world itself is pausing to watch. Then the volley lifts and falls. Again and again. The defenders raise shields into a canopy, overlapping higher, compressing inward, protecting what little remains of the center. Arms strain, shields tremble under impacts. The sound becomes a harsh rhythm of wood and metal, punctuated by the hiss of arrows cutting through damp air. Eventually, even the strongest posture cannot defy physics forever. Armor is heavy, muscles fatigue, space disappears. The ring sinks lower, first to a crouch, then to knees, then into stillness. When it ends, the hillock is quiet. Steam drifts across motionless shields, wind tugs at cloaks. The sea keeps whispering against the shore as if nothing has happened, as if the world isn't different now. From his terrace, Xerxes watches the last movement fade, and then he nods away. The pass is open, the road south is his. But the victory doesn't feel clean, because the resistance has already escaped the battlefield and entered the mind. The Greeks who retreated will carry the story into every council chamber, into every dockyard. They will repeat it until it becomes more than a defeat. It becomes proof. Persian troops move forward cautiously into the hot gates, stepping around debris, lifting a shield here, glancing at the wall there, trying, perhaps, to understand what kind of people choose to hold a doorway when escape is possible. And far away, down the southern road, the surpassing Greek forces continue marching, still in order, still together. That was the true objective all along. Thermopylae fell. But time was bought. And in war, time can be the difference between collapse and survival, between a story that ends and a story that continues.
News of Thermopylae reaches the Greek commanders like a cold wind, sharp, expected, and still somehow hard to breathe through. No one who understood the plan believed the hot gates could hold forever. The stand was never meant to be a permanent wall. It was meant to be time purchased in sweat, discipline, and sacrifice. Now the question becomes simple and terrifying. Time for what? For Themistocles, the answer has always been the same: to move the war to the only place where Persia's greatest advantage, its size, can be squeezed down until it becomes clumsy. To the sea. If Leonidas turned a mountain path into a weapon, Themistocles intends to do the same thing with water. But first, Athens must face a decision that feels, even now, almost unthinkable. Athens may have to abandon Athens. In modern terms, it's the kind of choice leaders make in disasters when the map is no longer a comfort. You don't save a city by refusing to move. You save a people by preserving what they can carry forward: institutions, memory, the ability to rebuild. Themistocles pushes that logic through the noise of politics and pride. Athens cannot defeat the Persian army on land in open terrain, not with cavalry and archers sweeping across fields, not against a force built to keep moving. So Athens evacuates, families, elders, children, down to the coast and onto ships. And here, the story changes texture. Because once Athens becomes a city on the move, it stops being stone and becomes strategy. It becomes a fleet. Years earlier, Themistocles had argued to invest in ships, using newly found silver to build naval power instead of monuments. At the time, it sounded like paranoia. Now it becomes the difference between extinction and survival. There's also prophecy, because the ancient world doesn't separate strategy from the sacred the way modern minds try to. Athens had an oracle about wooden walls. Some heard it and imagined palisades, a desperate barricade around the city. Themistocles heard wood and saw hulls. He turned a spiritual phrase into operational planning, and that is a kind of leadership we still recognize today, taking a vague promise people want to believe and translating it into something measurable, buildable, real. As Athens empties, Xerxes marches in. He takes the city and burns what can be burned. Temples are damaged, symbols are violated. The act is meant to be definitive, an imperial lesson written in smoke. From Xerxes' point of view, this should be the emotional collapse of Greek resistance. This is what empires expect, the moment the defiant realized they were small all along. But Themistocles has already made the war bigger than a single city. He wants the Persian fleet to fight where it cannot spread out, where numbers become traffic, where orders become confusion, where even superior resources can't compensate for bad geometry. So he chooses a place with the same logic as Thermopylae, a narrow strait. Salamis. If Thermopylae was a doorway of stone, Salamis is a doorway of water. Now, the battle Themistocles must win before the ships ever move is inside the Greek alliance itself. Not every Greek leader wants to commit at Salamis. Some want to retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth and defend the Peloponnese, essentially giving up on Athens again and turning the war into a smaller regional struggle. Themistocles understands what that would mean. If the fleet retreats too far south, the alliance fractures. Once fractured, Persia doesn't need to defeat Greece as a whole. Persia defeats it piece by piece. So Themistocles applies pressure. Political pressure. Emotional pressure. And according to many ancient accounts, deception. The sources suggest he sent messages to Xerxes, implying the Greeks were divided and planning to flee. The details are debated, as they often are with intelligence operations, but the idea is perfectly plausible and deeply modern. Information warfare. Get your enemy to act on the schedule you want. If Xerxes believes the Greeks are about to slip away, he may push his fleet forward too aggressively, entering the strait before he fully controls the conditions. And in a narrow strait, haste is not speed, it's disorder. That's the trap. So when the Persian fleet moves towards Salamis, it does so with confidence. A large navy, drawn from multiple parts of the empire, moves like a floating city. Phoenician ships, Egyptian ships, Ionian contingents, each with proud crews and different instincts, all trying to function as one. And then they enter the strait. The water tightens. The rocky shores come closer. The wind and current shape movement whether commanders like it or not. A fleet that is too big in a narrow space begins to betray itself. Ships struggle to turn. Oars overlap. Orders echo across water and arrive late. A maneuver that works in open sea becomes impossible when there's no room to complete it. Themistocles has been waiting for that moment. The Greek fleet, smaller but more cohesive, engages where coordination matters more than raw numbers. They know the local waters. Their command structure is tighter.
They don't need the sea to become a highway, they want it to become a bottleneck. From shore, Xerxes watches again as he watched at Thermopylae. And once again, the spectacle does not go the way he expected. Naval combat is chaos, always, but the strategic logic underneath Salamis is clean. Persia's numerical advantage turns into congestion. Congestion turns into collisions and confusion. Confusion turns into loss of control. The Greeks don't need to destroy every ship. They need to damage the fleet's ability to function as a coherent instrument of support and supply. Because that's what matters most for Xerxes' campaign. A huge land army deep in hostile territory depends on reliable sea lines. Food, equipment, communication, reinforcement, none of it flows smoothly if the sea is contested, and if the sea is unstable, the army becomes exposed to time, weather, and revolt. Now we reach a decision point that modern audiences sometimes misread. After Salamis, Xerxes withdraws with a significant part of his forces. In mythic retellings, it can look like fear, like the great king running home. In strategic terms, it looks like risk management. Xerxes is not only a battlefield commander, he is the center of an empire. If he becomes trapped in Greece with winter approaching, supply lines threatened, and instability brewing elsewhere, the entire imperial structure is at risk. Kings and empires don't just win battles, they maintain continuity. So Xerxes chooses to preserve the core of his power. He leaves a capable commander, tradition names Mardonius, to continue operations with a strong land force, while Xerxes himself returns towards Asia, keeping the empire's spine intact. The invasion isn't over, but it's no longer the unstoppable forward sweep it once was. And this is where Thermopylae's sacrifice reveals its full value. Thermopylae didn't win the war, but it bought time and created belief. Belief kept the alliance together long enough for Salamis to happen. Salamis then changed the structure of the war, forcing Persia to fight under growing constraints. In the following year, Greek forces win major victories on land and sea, Plataea and Mycale, ending the immediate invasion threat and pushing the conflict into a different phase. So what is the real takeaway here, if we're looking at it with modern eyes? It's that small powers don't survive by matching an empire's strength, they survive by denying it. Leonidas denied Persia time at Thermopylae. Themistocles denied Persia space at Salamis. And Xerxes, despite enormous resources, was forced to confront something empires hate, the loss of control over the narrative of inevitability. Because once people see that the giant can be delayed, the giant no longer feels like a force of nature. It feels like an opponent. And opponents can be beaten if you choose the battlefield carefully enough.
Thermopylae is one of those stories that refuses to die. You can tell it in a single sentence. Few stand against many, and people will already know what you mean. That's how powerful the image is. A narrow pass, a thin line, a choice that feels bigger than survival. But if we want to understand why Thermopylae still works on us, we have to look at what the legend highlights and what it quietly leaves out. The first thing to say, plainly, is that the 300 were never alone. The number is memorable, and that's why it survives. It's clean enough to carve into stone. But the defense began with thousands of Greeks in the pass. Spartans at the center, yes, but also men from Thespians, Phocis, Thebes, and other places. For 2 full days, it was a coalition holding the hot gates. The final phase, the last stand, did center on Leonidas and his 300, and on the Thespians who chose to remain with them. But even that moment is richer and more human when you remember it wasn't a solitary myth. It was a shared decision, made in the middle of a retreat, with fear and strategy pressing at the same time. The next thing we have to say is that Thermopylae was not a romantic suicide. It was a calculated delay. Leonidas stayed because the position had been outflanked. Once the Persians had found the mountain path, the pass could not be held indefinitely. At that point, staying wasn't about winning the battle. It was about making sure the rest of the Greek force could withdraw in order instead of collapsing into chaos. In modern military terms, what Leonidas became at Thermopylae was a rearguard. The function of a rearguard is brutally simple. You trade yourself for time. You hold long enough for others to escape and reorganize. You make the enemy pause. You make pursuit expensive. And you accept that your own survival is unlikely. That's not cinematic glory. It's grim professional clarity. And it worked.
Thermopylae bought the kind of time that doesn't show up in poems, but changes campaigns. Time for evacuation, time for political decisions, time for the Greek fleet to stay engaged, time for Themistocles to set the next trap at sea. Now, if we're looking at this with modern eyes, we also have to deal with a discomfort that the legend tends to smooth over. The Persian Empire is often portrayed as pure tyranny, and the Greeks as pure freedom. It makes for an inspiring story, but history is messier. Persia was a vast empire, yes, and it could be ruthless in war, but it was also administratively sophisticated. It often governed through local elites, tolerated many religions, and maintained systems of roads, communication, and taxation that were remarkably effective for the ancient world. And the Greek side wasn't a single moral ideal. Athens had its democracy, limited, exclusive, but revolutionary. Sparta was not democratic. Sparta was militarized, oligarchic, and dependent on Helot labor. Spartan citizens could dedicate themselves to warfare because a large enslaved population did the work that kept Spartan society running. That doesn't negate Spartan courage at Thermopylae, but it does complicate the slogan freedom versus tyranny. Thermopylae is inspiring, and it's also complicated. Both can be true. Xerxes, too, deserves a more honest frame than the cartoon version. Greek writers often present him as a figure of excess and arrogance, and certainly Xerxes used power theatrically. He wanted obedience to feel inevitable. He wanted defiance to be punished in a way that would discourage others. But the deeper lesson from a modern perspective is that Xerxes reveals the classic weaknesses of autocratic power. Autocrats often struggle to tolerate public defiance. They're surrounded by systems that filter bad news because subordinates fear displeasing the top. They become dependent on spectacle because spectacle reinforces legitimacy, and sometimes that need for symbolic dominance can distort practical decision-making. Thermopylae exposed that psychological vulnerability. It forced Xerxes to accept delay, and delay is precisely what his campaign could least afford. If Leonidas represents duty and sacrifice, Themistocles represents something else, something very modern. He represents systems thinking. He understood that Greece could not win by meeting Persia on open ground. He invested in naval power early. He persuaded institutions to accept painful trade-offs. He selected battlefields, narrow places, where Persia could not bring its full size to bear, and he likely used deception and information to force the enemy into those spaces. That's not the heroism of a single sword stroke. It's the heroism of building and organizing and persuading, of shaping conditions so that courage has a chance to matter. In a modern world, that kind of leadership is everywhere. We live under it constantly, whether we notice it or not. And then there is Ephialtes, the name that became a synonym for betrayal. History remembers Ephialtes as the villain because it's emotionally satisfying to put a face on catastrophe. But if we ask why he did it, the story becomes more uncomfortable and more relevant. Ephialtes likely acted out of self-interest, out of resentment, out of fear, out of a belief that Persia would win and it was safer to be on the winning side. He held local knowledge and realized it could be sold. That is a timeless vulnerability. Grand plans can be undone by one person who knows a path, sees an opportunity, and decides to trade information for reward. It's a reminder that wars are not only decided by armies, but by intelligence and by incentives. And Ephialtes' story also contains a warning that modern people understand intuitively. When you sell your usefulness as a one-time secret, you often become disposable the moment the secret is used. Betrayal rarely ends with satisfaction. It ends with isolation. After the war, Thermopylae became legend almost immediately. A stone lion was raised to honor Leonidas. A rondel inscription, often attributed to the poet Simonides, captured the essence of the story in one line, not a claim of victory, but a statement of duty. Stranger, tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws. That epitaph is revealing. It doesn't say, tell them we won. It says, tell them we did what we were supposed to do. That is why Thermopylae still resonates, because even in a modern world, we recognize the power of people who refuse to abandon responsibility when abandoning it would be easier. Thermopylae also became a tool, propaganda, morale, identity. The story boosted Greek unity, helped hold the coalition together, and fueled resistance for the battles that actually turned the war, Salamis at sea, Plataea on land, Mycale in the wider campaign. In that sense, Thermopylae is an early example of something we now see constantly, the ability of narrative to shape outcomes. A tactical defeat can become a strategic advantage if it produces belief, cohesion, and time. And that might be the most enduring modern lesson of all. Thermopylae wasn't the end, it was the spark. It taught Greece that the end hour could be delayed. It taught them that geography could be weaponized. It taught them that discipline and cohesion could stand in the way of mass, at least long enough to change the campaign's rhythm. And it left us with a metaphor that still applies centuries later. Because the world still produces hot gates. Sometimes they're literal places, narrow roads, choke points, defensive lines. Sometimes they're political moments, crises where small groups hold back larger pressures. Sometimes they're personal, moments where doing the right thing costs more than anyone wants to pay. Leonidas shows us the price of being the hinge. Themistocles shows us the power of shaping the system. Xerxes shows us the danger of confusing power with control. Ephialtes shows us how fragile grand plans can be when they meet local knowledge and human weakness. And the pass itself, the steaming springs, the cliffs, the narrow road, still feels like it's breathing, as if the earth remembers what happened there. Not because the stones care about kings, but because people do. And as long as people care, Thermopylae will remain what it has always been, a story about time, choice, and the strange kind of victory that can exist, even in defeat.